I love
animated
that
by
you
something,
focused on that. I'm like, no one's
right?
asked me about that change. I'm like, oh, yes.
Hello, Nick from Nick and Review here, and today I'm chatting with author Caroline Bicks. And if you are a writer or a Stephen King fan, then I think you're going to really appreciate this conversation. Caroline is an internationally recognized Shakespeare scholar who studied Renaissance poetry at Harvard University. She has her PhD in English literature from Stanford University, and she was tenured at Boston College. However, in 2017, she became the inaugural Stephen E. King Chair in Literature at the University of Maine. And that is what eventually led to her having unprecedented access to Stephen King's archives. We're talking the first, second, third drafts of some of his most popular works. She developed a working relationship with Stephen King, and after spending a year in his archives, wrote a book, Monsters in the Archives, My Year of Fear with Stephen King. And today we are chatting about that book, about Stephen King, and about all the little micro changes that make his writing so infectious. Enjoy my conversation with Caroline Bicks. Caroline, thank you so much for joining me. It is such an honor to meet you. Thanks for taking the time.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
And I just want to give you your flowers right off the bat here because I genuinely think, and I'm not saying this just to gas you up. I think this is one of the better books on the craft of writing. I think I got to adjust my shelf because I do think it actually needs to be on the shelf with Stephen King's on writing.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a book. Obviously, it's for King fans, but I think anybody who is wanting to be a writer and to write, I think you would agree that looking at those early drafts and seeing kind of how the sausage is made
Yeah.
is crucial to that education, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, when I wrote this book, I mean, I'm a Shakespeare scholar.
Hmm.
So when I took this job at the University of Maine, it was not as a horror specialist at all. I wrote this book really for anyone who cares about how great books get written.
Yeah.
I didn't come into this as like a Stephen King zealot, you know?
Yeah.
So I really wanted to write a book that was, first of all, not academic, but that still paid tribute to the art of writing, and did that kind of close reading work that I'm trained to do as a Shakespeare scholar, but to write it for as wide an audience as possible, not just King fans.
We're going to get into some of the Shakespeare comparisons because I think that's brilliant. But what I'd also really like to talk to you about is your class that you had beforehand, which is horror and humanity.
Yeah, that was.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit about it, but also your choice to bring Stephen King's Carrie into that and why that was an important piece for that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it actually started, if you don't mind if I just go back a little bit to when I was in the final stages of this job, the Stephen E. King Chair in Literature. And I was at Boston College for 15 years before that. And again, the department was looking for a Shakespearean. So the chair was named for Stephen King because he's our most famous alum. But so when I was getting ready to give my job talk, which is the sort of the final stage when you're up for this kind of a position, you're brought to campus. And I was like, well, I'm going to talk about my Shakespeare book that I'm working on about girls and cognition. But it'd be fun. Maybe I should pull in some Stephen King just for the heck of it, because, it's the Stephen King chair. Maybe that'll distinguish me from the other people who are being brought back to campus. And I was like, you know what? I remember in Carrie, it's been 40 years since I read it, but she's got some interesting things happening with her brain. And that's what I'm writing about with Shakespeare's girls. So, and literally I took it off my shelf. It was the copy from 40 years ago, and it just fell open to the page where he describes her mental puberty. And I thought, my God, this is like, how have I not made this connection before between Stephen King and Shakespeare? But it was really getting ready to give this job talk. That's when it happened. And from there, so I took the job and I was mostly teaching Shakespeare classes, but I did have this opportunity to teach a class in horror. And I thought, okay, well, why don't I pull together those original works I was thinking about together? So we read Carrie and we read Macbeth, because both of those are obviously those are incredibly powerful books about the power of the imagination and the power of the brain. And they're also talking about humanity, right? What does it mean to be a human, and where are the limits of your humanity? How does horror really ask those tough questions, right? About what makes you human and when are you ready to step beyond it? And I know we're going to talk about this probably with Pet Cemetery and
Yeah,
some of the
I
other
think I
books.
think that's why it's such a universal genre, and whether some people
Absolutely.
avoid it or not, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
can also be
The
part of it.
the
Is
ones that endure, the stories that
yeah,
endure, it's not because of the monsters.
yes.
It's because they're able to tap into those intensely human questions, right? About
And that's a great segue because I think you do this brilliant Macbeth bookend in your book, but also just comparison in general. And that's, you start with that Macbeth quote of present fears are less than horrible imaginings. Can you
yeah.
talk a little bit about like so I know there's that first aha moment of Shakespeare and King, but as you're
Mhm.
in the archives and especially with Macbeth, what
Mhm.
surprised you about why these two guys are so similar?
I mean, honestly, when I went into the archives, which is a whole nother story, that I talk about, like, how did I get in the archive? How did I meet Stephen King? I mean, it took 4 years before I even met him, and that I got up the, bravery to ask him if I could spend a year in the personal archives. I really didn't know what I was going to find. And I certainly wasn't going into this thinking, I'm going to make a connection between Stephen King and Shakespeare. I really went in the way that I always tell my students to go into any kind of project. Just keep your mind open. Don't know what you're looking for ahead of time or you're going to miss things. So, but day one, I went in there and I started looking at the Pet Cemetery draft that had all of the back and forths with the copy editor with his handwritten responses, which was what a treasure. I mean, I couldn't believe that was day one. I was like, wow, this is going to be an amazing year. Um, but that day one, I started to see how intentional he was about his word choices in his conversations with the copy editor, where the copy editor would say, "Is this the word that you meant?" Like, and he's like, "Yes, this is the word I meant, and this is why." And what he would often bring up was the way a word sounded. So he said, say it out loud. You'll see at one point when he's talking to the copy editor. He's always very gracious and he's like a
Mhm.
teacher. Um, say it out loud, you'll see. And I thought, well, my God, of course, Shakespeare is meant to be heard, right? And the reason Shakespeare had lived in my head since I was 12, the same time that I was introduced to Stephen King, they both have this ability to mobilize word sound, which I hadn't appreciated about Stephen King until I was in there seeing him explaining to the copy editor his choices. And I thought, my God. And then getting to have conversations with him about it, like particular word sounds and why he was returning to them and his revisions and pulling them forward. And that was kind of the one of the first aha moments about the ways that Shakespeare and Stephen King are both masters of word sound. Because you wouldn't necessarily put them together, right?
Some
Because
people,
one's a playwright and one is a
I was going to say, and
novelist.
then and then
They're
some would also
different
say
genres.
it's hyperbolic to compare the two, maybe.
Of
But
course, like, oh, it's so easy to say that because but I'm like,
sure,
actually, and I'm sure, if you had the ability to go back and look at other great writers' archives, we'd probably find similar
yeah.
attention to word sound because I really believe that's why stories stick in our heads. Yeah, I
Hmm.
mean, yes, you're imagining an incredible world, but you're also able to get at readers' brains in a different way if you can have word sounds reverberating and echoing in your brain. So that was sort of number one with the Shakespeare. But go ahead. Did you have a?
Well, I was just a thought that I had with that was it's almost like words are the cinematography of the books, right? Like if the camera is that kind of, and then the camera is the paintbrush of the,
Right, right.
of the scene, then the words are
Yeah.
actually the thing that's bringing it together and
They
making it
are the
come alive,
matter,
right?
right? I mean,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that's when I was talking to him about those discoveries I was making with Pet Cemetery, which was the first one that I decided to dive into for a couple months. He said that to me. He said, the scene matters. He says that matters. He says you have to pay attention. All of the senses have to be open. He said, but in particular, he says he thinks about how the words are going to clang on the reader's ear. So he's thinking about that oral
yeah,
aspect when
yeah.
he's creating. But yes, of course, it's all of the senses have to be engaged.
Well, talk to me a little bit about your also discovery of The Shining because I think
Oh
that
God,
was mind blowing for
that
me.
was that was a whole nother level of Shakespeare and Stephen King that I
Yeah,
was like,
I
again,
never.
had zero idea that's what I'd be finding. So,
Yeah,
I mean, um, that was extraordinary. So in the archives, they have what is truly the first draft of The Shining. Other people claim they have seen it or they've published versions of it, but it's not the same. This one's this one, Wendy is called Jenny. So
Hmm.
that's sort of the big giveaway. It has a totally different ending that King was generous enough to let me publish, actually, so you can see the manuscript
Hmm.
page is very different. I don't want to give away what happens. But in the very first draft, and it's called The Shine, um, the first couple drafts are called The Shine. But what was extraordinary was he's divided into acts and scene numbers, just like a Shakespeare play, like with Roman numerals, right? And people might have forgotten, or if they've only seen the Kubrick film, they might not know that Jack is actually a playwright in the novel, The Shining. He's trying to write the great American play. And he's
Hmm.
even referred to as, he has a dream of being the great American Shakespeare. Or I think Jenny calls him that. But it's really so he was obviously so when I saw that, I was like, huh. And then I ran across an introduction in the archives. They had uh, an introduction he had written to a Whispers magazine edition where they had published something that never made it to print, but was the original opening of The Shining called Before the Play. And
Right.
that's
Yes.
where I came across King writing that he was imagining a Shakespearean tragedy when he wrote The Shining. And that was when I was like, mind blown. What's happening? Like, why am I on this journey? Clearly, I've been sent from somewhere, I don't know, to be this one strange combination of people to be sitting here. Um, so then, of course, I became obsessed with like, well, which one? Which Shakespearean tragedy? And I didn't want to ask him because I didn't want to be again, I like to go in with my mind open. So and it was like a great mystery. I'm like, oh, which one? Which one? Because I love The Shining. And I did find traces of Macbeth, references to Macbeth lines that didn't make it to the next draft. So I was like, oh, it must be Macbeth. It makes so much sense, right? I mean, there's hallucinations and, um, bashing out a baby's brains and all the things
Yeah.
that feel very Shining, and Macbeth. And then ultimately, when I talked to him and finally got the answer, it was like, oh, he was like, well, that's not really the one. But I mean, obviously, there were traces of it in there, but there was another one that he was thinking of that made so much more sense actually once he said it to me. So anyway, that was
That's
one of
for the
my
book. Yeah.
favorite.
Yeah.
That's for the
Exactly.
book, but that was one of my favorite discoveries was, oh, wow, the Shakespeare that's at the foundation of this brilliant, brilliant novel about intergenerational trauma.
Yeah. And what's great is you do actually present it as a mystery because there is that kind of moment as the reader that you're stumbling upon it and it's like, oh my God,
Well,
oh,
that
like
was what I
this
was
little
hoping to
twist,
do.
you know?
I've never written anything like this, but I
Yeah.
really wanted to take readers with me
Yeah.
on this
Yeah.
journey because
It's an archaeological
I
journey
knew
that
it was
you're on.
such a once in a lifetime opportunity and that other people weren't going to get to go on this
Yeah.
journey physically, but I could bring them in and tell the story. So I'm glad
So
you.
that's kind of a great segue because King writes, and I'm so glad you reference it because it's the thing in On Writing that stuck with me the most, which is his talking about writing as telepathy and time
Yeah.
travel and that connection. So I know you hinted at how amazing it was, but talk about getting in there, and you're basically connected to 25-year-old King, 30-year-old King, this younger man over
Yeah.
time. What was
Yeah.
that like?
It was amazing. It was a full sensory experience, just as he writes about, because again, I had no preconceived ideas about this. I didn't even really know a ton about his biography other than reading on writing. And when I asked him if I could do this project, and again, it was a great act of trust that he and Tabitha let me into those archives for a full year. They hadn't let anyone in there for that extended amount of time. And one of the way I pitched it to them was I said, I'm not going to psychoanalyze you. I'm not looking to unbury, secrets about your life. This is really about a love letter to language and craft. Like, that's why I want to write this. I want to understand how you wrote these stories that have stuck in my head and scared me for 40 years, which is why I stick just to the five that I read when I was a teenager in the
Mhm.
70s, and the early 80s. Um, so I didn't think this was going to end up being as biographical as it became. But as I was going and sort of diving into each individual set of manuscripts, I could see stories emerging out of each one. I know that sounds kind of hoodoo voodoo, but it was like, it really did feel like there were stories that were asking to be told, or wanted to be told. And then as I would have conversations with him, again, I never pried, I never asked anything personal, but he would bring up personal things. And in that case, I was like, okay, that's a story that he's obviously okay with me telling. So I felt like I did get to know different ages of him, you know? I mean, this came up definitely during my Salem's Lot research.
Hmm.
One
Yeah.
of my favorite conversations with him was when he was telling me about moving to Durham, Maine when he was 11.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know that he hadn't lived in Maine before that. I mean, he was born in Maine, but they left at age 2 for him. He didn't move back to Maine until 11. That's a big stretch of time. And 11 is such a important developmental stage, right? Um, that that conversation where he talked about hating the town at first, but
Mm.
then loving it, like falling in love with it. He was so animated talking about that. Um, so when you ask about like getting to know King or like that piece of it, like that, I felt like I really, as much as you can know somebody, right? What he was revealing told me a lot about 11-year-old Stephen King, right? 11 and 12. And that gave a depth to my understanding of how he was crafting and redrafting Salem's Lot to make Mark Petrie, that 12-year-old boy, to make
Yes.
his
Because the
brain,
ages change. Yes, yes,
the ages
exactly. Yeah,
change,
yeah,
and
yeah.
Ben Mears's
Yeah.
age
Yeah.
gets increasingly a little bit older. In draft one, he's
That's
only
right.
5. When
Yeah.
he lived in Salem's Lot, then he's 7, then he's 9. So it's like I felt like the story there was that, it's adult Stephen King and 12-year-old Stephen King meeting in this town of Salem's Lot slash Durham. So that was a case where, again, I had no idea that was what the story was going to end up being for that chapter. I was just in there tracking. I mean, for each of these, really what I did was I just sort of read every draft available that was in the archives, and there are many. Each one has typically 3 to 4 drafts.
Hmm.
And just I really just wanted to track the marginalia, the edits, scenes he had taken out, micro changes he was making to words, notes he was making to himself. He leaves such a wonderful trail.
Hmm.
So that was what my initial project was. But then there was this added layer that started to emerge, right, where he would talk about his personal situations sometimes. And it
That's no
added
surprise
another
to me,
layer.
though, because I think Stephen King, his books are so much about humanity of the characters that
Absolutely.
it almost to do a project like that, it would naturally happen that there'd be this biographical element out of this layer,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But I think because I am trained as a literature scholar, we're not supposed to talk about personal things.
Right,
And
right.
so it was a really interesting, so it was a journey for me as a writer too, because I had written first person essays, based on my own life, um, over the past 15 years. Like I did a modern love column and, I was experimenting with my own voice, but I had never brought my own voice and someone else's story to a study of language.
Mm,
And so it was a real experiment for me. And again, as a scholar, you're trained to stay objective, right?
mm.
And now I'm never going back to that. I think
Yeah.
you have to bring your whole self and the whole self of your subject.
Can you, I wonder if you could answer this for me, and obviously, but like I have a theory. I'm just wondering what Stephen King's first drafts were like, and I know you were looking at some drafts that are later in his career,
Mhm.
but were these like, did you see the expert craft of essentially a little bit of a prodigy? Because I have a theory that his first drafts are quite well put together still,
They are.
even though the story is changing and
You know what?
evolving, right? But like, yeah.
They are. Yeah. I mean, they are the ones I was looking at, they're all typewriter, so it's not like you can just go delete. It's not like they're missing versions of phrases that he just was able to delete out. I mean, you can see the typewritten pages. You can see, it's the Olivetti
Mhm.
typewriter that he writes about in On Writing that was Tabby's typewriter. And yes, they are almost, I don't want to say they're almost perfect, but they really are intact.
Yeah.
Like and when he changes, I mean, sometimes he does make big changes to the plot, but The original ones are still pretty damn good.
There's
Like
still stories like
they're
beginning,
still
middle, and
full
end. Yeah.
stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He's not doing like, but also it's a different time. And I grew up in the 70s, in the 80s. I had to use a typewriter for
Yeah.
my papers, like you did have to have it pretty well thought out.
Yeah, I do wonder about
Um,
that because some of us writers, I write as well, and I grew because we grew up with word software, word
yeah.
processors. Our first drafts are all over the place because we can change, like we
Yeah.
can move paragraphs around like that, right? But
Yeah,
it does
yeah.
feel like King really, just to make another hyperbolic comparison, like it's that Mozart channeling something onto the page directly.
You know
Feels
what?
like, you know,
It does feel that way, I have to say. Like when you look at those early drafts, um, they're fully formed.
yeah.
They are. And when he goes back, it's really to tweak, you know, he wrote this to me just like last month. He's constantly like, he likes to talk about his process, and I'm not asking him questions anymore, but sometimes he'll just be like, so here's the way I write. I'm like, oh, okay, gem. I'm like saving all his emails. Like, it's incredible. He's like, I first I write it out. Then it's second draft, I go back and I tweak. And third one, I polish.
Mm.
And I think that's the way he's been writing since he started all of this,
Oh, it's
when he was
brilliant.
when he was 17 and
Yeah.
writing Rage.
Yeah. Let's talk about the like as much as it's tweaking, the mammoth changes that come out of
Yeah.
some of those things. And I
Yeah.
had written down a couple sentences from Pet Cemetery. First of
Mhm.
all, there is yes, Gage's exhumation and the word choices that really keep us into a very visceral feeling situation there. But the sentence I wrote down that I just thought was brilliant is when possessed Gage or Gage has come back and is going through Lewis's bag. And the literal word change, it goes from the low clink and shift as the things were moved to a low clink and shift as the things were moved. And you make a point to talk about how that change makes it less like it becomes less conscious of a possession thing as opposed to him just kind of being
I
animated
love that
by
you
something,
focused on that. I'm like, no one's
right?
asked me about that change. I'm like, oh yes. I mean,
It's
this is
brilliant.
the thing. It's like the
Yeah.
literary scholar in me, this is like moth to a flame, like being able to dig into like tiny word choices like that makes such a difference. And that was really in the context, and that was to me one of the more moving discoveries was seeing how he had originally written Gage's Return.
Mhm.
Um, and it's much more like EC comic book kind of like the deathly breath, the thing of evil. It was an ancient evil. Like there's a lot of ancient evil language
Right.
attached to Gage in the first draft. It's still a brilliant draft.
Hmm.
But it's much more pure evil when he comes back. And what was really shocking and really moving to me was how he was letting Gage be still a little bit of a little boy as he drafted and changed it. So that it's not like he's after the scalpel because he knows he wants to murder. It's more like there's just a click. It's not the click. You know, he's not laughing with an evil laugh anymore as he is in the first one.
Yeah.
There's no evil glinting in his eyes. It's more like he's a sleepy toddler, is how it came across to me. Like, and I think this is another thing that really, as I was working through this, because I had read all these books when I was younger, to come back to them as an adult, as someone who's had children, I was approaching them I was obviously, it was hitting me in a different kind of way. And I think that's another reason these stories endure is because they just have an ability to meet you wherever you are in your timeline,
Hmm.
and your
Well, it's
life experience.
I just reread Carrie last year or 2 years ago, and similar to you, first time I read it was discovering it in the library at like 12 or something. So
Right.
revisiting it, it is interesting to kind of always go back to these stories when, for many of us, The Shining, Carrie, we read them as teenagers, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because we have a whole bunch more context. But yeah, I like for me that was the one that stuck out because it's such a tiny word change, and you help us, the reader, along understand why it makes such a shift. But then a couple others I highlighted grating to gritting, like
Ah,
the
the gritty
sound,
to gritty.
and then in Pet or in Salem's Lot rather, which I loved is the ending eased to urged,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And
it just
and
brilliant.
just thank you. And but also just that, that one has such a different little ending where he and Mark Petrie decide, Ben and Mark decide they're just going to leave. They're going back to Mexico and they're never going back to the town in the first draft ending. And, it matters that as he's revising, he decides, no, they're going to go back together and they're going to fight it.
Yeah,
Not just burn the town down, but,
yeah,
Mark's really going to takes his hand, right? And it's like very powerful union of Ben and Mark by the time he's done
yeah.
drafting.
I really hope that that's a thing writers especially take away from your book and King points it out in the book to you, is that it's, yes, the scene, the plot, the characters, the dialogue, all that, sure, but these
Yeah.
tiny little word changes
Tiny
are the
changes.
thing that will help the themes emerge and crystallize, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
just absolutely brilliant. Yeah,
Oh,
sorry,
thank
go
you.
ahead. Yeah, yeah,
No, no, I was just going
yeah.
to say one of my favorite discoveries with Pet Cemetery was that iconic line, sometimes dead is better.
Sometimes that is better.
That, and I was like, oh my God, no, that was originally sometimes death is better.
Yes.
And that's just not as good. Like
Yeah.
that's an example. Like he recognized I can make this line more powerful and resonant,
Yeah.
right? If I change death to dead,
And some of it
right?
is just the sound as
Just
well.
the
Just
sound.
the
Dead is
dead,
better. Dead is better.
dead,
It echoes,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Death is better is not as
yeah. Well,
it's not
it's
as
a little bit
sticks.
too almost academically
Yes.
as opposed to
Absolutely.
the grittiness of just dead, right?
Dead.
Yeah,
Dead is
yeah.
final.
Oh, it's brilliant.
Death is a concept.
Yeah. See, we could just geek out and nerd
See, we could just
over the
geek out on
words.
that one line, but I'm sure you have other questions you'd like to talk about other
Well,
books.
one thing I do want to talk about is I was particularly struck, and I was sitting with my girlfriend on the train, and I handed your book over to her to read this one paragraph because I think it's your best paragraph in the book.
Wow. Okay.
And I won't highlight it, but it's about the woman in the room and how
Oh yeah.
you specifically talk about how reading and writing stories are these rare examples of a morally justified acts. Can you talk a little bit about that discovery of that
I
short story? I
mean
know the
that
boogeyman was big for you, but it feels like the
Boogeyman
woman
was
in the
was the
room.
one I read when I was 12. That
Yeah.
was the first. So Night Shift is the center chapter of the book, and I didn't intend it to be. Honestly, I was going intuitively through this whole process. So, even like how I treated each set of manuscripts, it was really like what I felt like I should do next. So I started with Pet Cemetery, then I did The Shining, and then I hit Night Shift. And I was a little nervous about the Night Shift research because there aren't a lot of early drafts of the stories, um, because he really sold almost all of them, before they ended up in Night
Hmm.
Shift. He sold them to men's magazines. It was
Hmm.
part of the story about him and Tabitha trying to make ends meet. They've got two little children, and so we have a lot of the early versions of the stories are just already published, right? Um, but Woman in the Room, he did not sell to a men's magazine. So there are only four in Night Shift out of the 20 that he didn't sell. Woman in the Room is the one that is based on his own mother's death. And when I was 12 and read that, I don't even remember that story. It didn't even register. It wasn't creepy. It wasn't like, it was just a woman dying in her hospital bed, with her son having to make this horrible decision of should he help her die or not. And to be clear, King did not help his mother die, but he was definitely with her when she died. And so it's very much an autobiographical story. Um, and there is an early version in the archives that's slightly different than the one that ends up in print. And it's originally called The Last of Her. He's typed it. It's on the Olivetti. It's called The Last of Her. He crosses it out with a pencil and writes time in a glass that ran. So he was clearly like working through like what is this? What
Hmm.
is this? How am I going to tell this story about my mother's death? What does it mean? Like it's very powerful. And then I came across that 1991, I believe, or 1990 anthology that he could have submitted any of his stories to. He was invited to, the greatest horror stories of all time, and he picks that one out of the just scores he'd written by that point. And he has an author's note in that particular edition where he writes about that story being therapy for him. And he wrote it as therapy. and how he doesn't enjoy rereading it, but he does because it helps him, right? It's a part of his life. It's a part of who he is. And that just was a beautiful expression to me. So about like stories are a moral, right? Reading and writing stories, it's a it's a moral act, right?
Hmm.
Because it connects you to who, back to our original conversation about horror helping you sort of suss out where the limits of your humanity, right? The fact that that story, he considers it horror, right? And it would end up in Night Shift, but it's not because it's got monsters or anything supernatural, right? And that to me really helped me dig more deeply into why horror is a genre that does so much work for us, right? That it is something that helps us metabolize our grief
Hmm.
or our fears of
Yeah.
loss, very real loss that's coming for all of us if we live long enough. And that story and his writing about it was so profound. Like I still get kind of weepy when I think about it because it's just like it's so raw,
Hmm.
so vulnerable when he writes that. He writes it right after his mother dies.
Yeah.
And again, didn't publish it, until Night Shift.
It's another reason, though, why I think this is such a great book for writers, not just on the craft, but it's like that discovery that you make with that story and the
Hmm.
kind of the why of it all
The why.
is such an important thing for just artists in general and just people who are always struggling with that
Yeah, yeah,
why,
exactly.
right?
And that was a great example of a draft where I could really see him shifting the focus,
Mm,
because the first version of it, he gives much more of his mother's backstory. And he cuts that by the time he gets to the final version. It really focuses in on the main character, the son, and a memory. He inserts a memory of him when he was 12 and he finds his grandmother dead and his mother, he's
hmm.
calling out to his mom for help, like, Mom. I was like, oh, right, because what the story is about losing your mom, right? It's
Yeah,
about like how important that if you're lucky enough to have a mother who can help you through. And I saw him doing the same thing with Pet Sematary, actually, interestingly. Like in the first draft of Pet Sematary, his mother's the one who dies, and his father, in that when he's exhuming
yeah,
Gage and he's having a memory and he's remembering in the published version, it's his cousin Ruthie, and he remembers his mother telling him that his cousin Ruthie has died, and it's his first experience with death, And his mother's very empathetic and is like, I know, honey, I know, I'm so sorry, but she's gone. She's dead. In the first draft, his father's telling him that his mother's died, and his father's being a total asshole about it. He's like,
yes,
yeah, yeah, she's dead. She's not coming back. And it's like, wow, right? But so as he redrafts, right, he's thinking about, right, what's the emotional core, right? It's about like it makes Lewis so much more human, or well, he's always human, but the struggle he's having with whether or not how far are you going to go to bring back someone you love, right?
yeah,
That he's having that memory and he's remembering his mother helping him through Ruthie,
yeah.
right? And he's thinking about should I or shouldn't I with my own son.
I think that scene, just to geek over that scene again, is one of the quintessential horror scenes
It
of
is.
any media because it's drenched in so much
That's
relatable emotion while being
yeah.
absolutely terrifying with what's happening.
Yeah, and that's the scene that made him put the book in a
Yeah.
drawer and say, "You
Yeah.
know what? I'm not publishing this one."
Yeah.
Until he had
No.
to get out his double day contract.
So I'm so glad you talked about kind of the organic process of developing this book because one of the things I wanted to ask was your drafting process of this.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was brilliant to kind of end with Carrie, kind of going back to this first book that broke him into the mold. But how much of this was, as you had kind of mentioned, like you did start with Pet Sematary, and then how much changed from draft to draft with this book? Like, what were some big major changes for you?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I wrote it after I had already spent the year in the archives, so I hadn't written anything. I was just taking notes. I was just making observations, and I wasn't even sure it was going to be a book. Honestly, I kind of sat with it like I don't know what this is going to be, you know. Um, and then I was like, okay, I think it's time to turn this into something. um, and I decided when I was going to sit down to write it, I was going to let it unfold the way I had gone into the archives. And that's when I realized that I had started with the most recent one and ended with the oldest one. And for whatever reason, intuitively, that's just how it had gone. And I think part of it was I was following like these layers, right? I was so glad that it ended up being that way because by the time I got to Carrie, and I think I had put off Carrie because I felt like it was such an overdetermined book. I really didn't know what I would find that would be new because I was like,
Mm-hmm.
what hasn't been written about Carrie? I mean, it's like, it's so iconic.
Mm-hmm.
Not that the others aren't, but it just felt like I don't know what I'm going to find. So I think I put it off thinking, I don't know, you know. Um, by the time I got to it, I had this rich, all these other layers of things that I had already discovered about him and his writing process, so that I think I could appreciate it more. So um, anyway, I got the book contract having only written the Pet Cemetery chapter.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then I had a wonderful editor at Hogarth, David Ebershoff, who was so wonderful about helping me bring all my voices to the table. He really encouraged me to tell more of my own story as I was writing it. So um, from that, it really did flow, honestly. It just felt like maybe because it had been marinating for so long, it was like ready. It was like, okay, I knew what I wanted to say. Like once I figured out the story of each of the novels that I wanted to tell, it just fell into place. And I was able, except for the night shift chapter, that one caused me the most kind of struggle. I think again because I really didn't know what I had found and why it mattered, you know. Um, but I had gone back to all of his columns as an undergraduate for that chapter that he wrote for the Maine campus newspaper in 1969 and 1970. And I had
Mm-hmm.
done that because I really, as I write in the book, like I needed a break. I had just finished The Shining research and I was like so overwhelmed. I was like, I think I need to take a break because The Shining really was traumatic, in a lot of ways, and intense. So I was like, okay, I'm going to take a break. I'm just going to read all of his columns he wrote when he was an undergraduate. I mean, how scary could that be? Uh,
Yeah.
and so I had all these notes when it came time to write the night shift chapter. I was like, well, I had all these notes about things he'd written about. And I had some of the notes about the different stories and some of the changes I'd seen him making, but I didn't have as much material to work with the drafts. But I was like, well, why don't I start with those columns? Like that seems like a great way in, actually,
Mm.
to thinking about who young Steve King was, not the 11-year-old in Durham, but the
The young adult.
the
Yeah.
undergraduate,
Yeah. Yeah.
because he writes a lot of those night shift stories when he's an undergraduate
Mm-hmm.
and then right after graduation. So it seemed like that would be good. So that was an example of that chapter took me the longest to sort of figure out. Once I did, it came out pretty effortlessly.
Yeah.
So that was the process. And it took me about a year to get a full draft, which
Okay.
is pretty quick,
Yeah.
for considering, because I was also working full time by that. I'm a full-time
Mhm.
professor, teacher. That sabbatical year was like
And
this
you have a
magic.
Shakespeare podcast, I might
I
add.
have
Like
a
you
Shakespeare
have
podcast,
a lot
Everyday
going on.
Shakespeare,
Yeah.
which I love doing with my really good friend Michelle Ephraim. So
Yeah.
plug for that. If you want to have fun and think about Shakespeare, that's the podcast. So it's just a lot going on,
Yeah.
So I felt like a year that was pretty good to get that generated.
Yeah.
And then, David, my editor, had changes he thought I should make to the last two chapters. So those I had to sort of rethink a little bit, but overall it
Just
was,
to give love to the editors, though, that was one thing I wanted to talk to you about because I'm fascinated. Again, yes, so much has been talked about with Carrie and the major changes of that of really reining it in and bringing the humanity out
yeah, yeah,
in that character. But talk about kind of what you observed of Bill Thompson's role in early King,
yeah,
from Salem's Lot to Carrie and some of
yeah.
those other pieces.
Yeah, and that again, there's a lot on the record about that. Like there are scholars who've done great work on that, and people who aren't technically scholars, but who certainly know a lot about the Bill Thompson relationship. Bill Thompson's done interviews. So if you want to know more about that, I've got links in my notes to places you can go to learn more about that relationship. So I knew, for example, that Bill Thompson had advised him to take out the more comic book parts of Carrie, right? So I knew that going into that. So I think that's another reason I had avoided Carrie because I was
Mm,
like, well, what am I going to find that's new? You know, and sure enough, I mean, that first draft of Carrie that's in the archives is crazy.
yeah.
She literally is like, I know you've done an episode about this, so like she's
Yeah.
got horns. Sure, she's like a giant brain sack. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So that part I knew I wasn't going to be revealing anything new, but something I did find that I was I don't think you would have known if you hadn't been in the archives, is that in the final draft that's in the archives. So this is it's about to go to print, like it's copy edited, it's like moving forward. Um, and there's a memo that's in the archives from Bill Thompson to the copy editor and the compositor saying, note, locale has changed to Maine. Make sure we've caught all of the references to Boston, right? So, because I had noticed that the first two drafts were set in Boston, and that was just strange to me. Like, I had been living in Boston recently. I was like, you've got Filene's Basement, and you've got Framingham, and Andover, Mass is where I'm like, what? Like, to me, that's when that story started to emerge for me about Carrie for that chapter, because I was like, wait a minute, why did it change to Maine? Like, what? Why did it start in Boston? And when I asked Steve about it, he was like, I don't even remember that, which was really
Wow.
interesting,
Yeah.
you know? Um, and what he said to me was, he said, well, I imagine that, Bill Thompson, who at the time I had to do what he said because he was the editor and I was a new writer, he probably said, you're a Maine boy. You should bring it back to Maine. Um, you're not a Boston boy. That's what Steve told me. But what I started to notice too, one of the gifts of the archives is that Steve's very good about putting dates on his manuscripts.
Yes.
And one of the things um, that I uncovered that I don't think people know about. I mean, it's interesting. Like Salem's Lot, when he first starts writing Salem's Lot, he's still working on Carrie. Like it's not like he finishes Carrie, then he writes Salem's Lot. Like he's drafting Salem's Lot the same, not simultaneous necessarily, but overlap.
Hmm.
So as he's revising Carrie, he's imagining and writing Salem's Lot, which is indisputably a Maine book, right? I mean, Salem's Lot, as we've talked about, Durham
Hmm.
is that's the town, right, of Salem's Lot. That is a Maine book. But what I noticed was that it's the day after he sells the paperback rights to Carrie, which is like a legendary story, right? That's
Yeah.
that's the sell that changes the King's lives, right?
Yeah.
$400,000 for the paperback rights. The day after that is the day that's the end date he writes at the end of the first draft of Salem's Lot called Second Coming.
Interesting.
So that to me told a different story that I don't think people know, and that I didn't ask Steve about it because I think it's kind of like he might not even remember that. But that's a case where your manuscripts are leaving behind a trail, right? And I'm
Yeah.
thinking he probably felt like it was okay to finally finish Salem's Lot and send it because
Yeah.
he had sold the paperback rights.
Yeah. It's like
It
this
was like
confirmation, this
confirmation. It's like
affirmation of him as
it's
a,
time
yeah.
now. I
Yeah.
can send this now to Bill Thompson.
Yeah.
And sure enough, that's the draft he sends to Bill Thompson. So that to me was a really interesting case of I can't remember what got me onto this, what you had asked me about,
Well,
but
I just think Bill Thompson in general and
oh,
his
Bill
relationship
Thompson,
with
right.
him.
So I was thinking about that
Yeah.
relationship and he
Yeah.
probably felt like that was okay. But the change to Maine as the Carrie locale
Hmm.
happens after he submits the Salem's Lot draft to Thompson. My guess is that Thompson saw that and was like, yeah, he is a Maine writer. And that's what changed the locale.
And
I can't confirm it. I don't know. I
sure.
haven't
Yeah.
talked, but I suspect
I
that's
kind of like that you can confirm that though. Like there's
yeah,
elements of the mystery that are,
right.
you can kind of suppose, but as you said, there's evidence and there's you use the word data points a lot as
Yeah,
well
right,
of that, and
right.
he does leave behind this trail that you can decide to piece together, and it makes sense, you know.
Yes, and someone else might see a different story,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
that's what I saw. And it also really suggested to me that that's part of why Carrie as a novel endures as an American story, not a Maine story, right?
Yeah.
Because when he first imagined it, it's as a Boston suburban girl. And I think, when in my conversations with him that I had afterwards, and he was saying, yeah, Carrie really became an all-American girl, was the phrase he used with me.
Right.
And I was like, right, all-American, not Maine, right?
Yeah.
So it makes sense to me that he first imagined her as a Boston girl. Like it almost is irrelevant, right, where she is, because that story in particular is about just being a teenager in America. It could be any high school in America.
But again, the subtle changes and the impacts that they have, it's
Yeah,
interesting that Bill was able to foresee that, because
yeah,
of course that also then turns into this alternate universe of Maine all these decades later
exactly, right,
that exists, right?
right.
In this connected King universe. Like
Right.
that's the beginning pieces of it, which is really,
That's the
really
beginning piece
fascinating,
of
you
it.
know?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
no,
that
right.
memo. Maybe that memo
Yeah.
is like the planted the
That's the
seeds of
flashpoint.
Derry and Castle Rock and
Yeah.
all those others.
Yeah.
That's a great theory.
Yeah, it's the turtle throwing it up. So on
Yeah.
that note, just referencing other stuff, just to close our chat,
Mhm.
you're given another year in his archive. What three books are you going for? I know these four were or five were important to you because of when you discovered them, but what would be ones where you're like, I'd love to just see the drafts on that one and the paper trail on that one.
Should I get permission to go back in? I'd love to do it. I would love to do a deep dive into it because that was another one that had a huge impact on me as a young adult. And it's also because that is his first like dairy book, right?
Hmm.
And it's Bangor, and Bangor means a lot to me
Mm.
because I have to have a personal connection to it. I think I don't want to just go in and do a autopsy on these manuscripts. There has to be a living
Yeah.
story behind it as well. So that one I'd love to look at. Um, Honestly, I'm really interested in those books from the early '90s. That cluster of female-centric books where he really writes fascinating three-dimensional female characters who are all experiencing trauma.
Yeah.
I would be really interested to talk to him about what that was about and also just sort of see how he crafted. So Gerald's
I was
Game,
just gonna say I'm not sure of the dates, but like Dolores
Dolores
Claiborne. Yeah.
Claiborne,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
Rose Madder. Like all
Yes.
three of those are like right in the early night. Like they're all in this same moment. So I'd be really interested to read those next to each other and
Mm.
see that. And because my academic interest and personal interest is in gender and Shakespeare, and all my books have been about gender in some way. But I don't really write about that in Monsters in the Archives. Um, I could That could be a really interesting
Yeah.
next project.
I'm glad you said it too, because I do think it would be fascinating just to see his process with a tome, like
Yeah.
something as big as that in the
I know,
stand.
because I almost did the stand for this book, but I was like, because that one made a huge impact on me when I was a
Yeah.
teenager. But I was like, it's too big,
It's a
and
year. That's a year.
that's a year in itself. And he's already come out with the revised edition,
Hmm.
in 1990. So it's like he already made his statement about what he thought mattered about that book.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that's just sort of inklings of what I'm thinking about. I'm still 2 years away from another sabbatical, so we'll see.
I hope you get the chance again because
Thank you.
it's brilliant work that you did. Caroline,
Thank you.
thank you so much for chatting with me about this.
Oh,
I've learned so much as a writer, and I think King fans and writers alike are just gonna, well, they already are devouring your book, but more should and more will. It's fantastic.
thank you so much, Nick. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks, Caroline. Bye.